The notification sound from my phone cut through the silence of my empty kitchen like a knife. It was 2:47 a.m., and I couldn't sleep, again. The comment had been sitting in my mind for 3 days straight, replaying on an endless loop. "You're so out of touch, Margaret. You have no idea what real people go through." Out of touch? Me, Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield, 52 years old, mother of 3, widow of 6 years, and apparently completely disconnected from reality, according to a stranger on the internet. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The comment had come from a heated discussion on my neighborhood Facebook group about the proposed property tax increase. I had suggested that maybe, just maybe, we could all afford an extra $100 a year to improve our children's schools. The response was swift and brutal, not just from one person, but from dozens. "Easy for you to say. Must be nice to have money. You don't understand what it's like for working families." But here's the thing they didn't know about me. The thing that made their words cut so deep. I knew exactly what it was like. I had lived it. I was still living it in ways they couldn't even imagine. 6 years ago, when David died suddenly from a heart attack at 48, I thought I had prepared for everything. We had life insurance, we had savings, we had a plan. What we didn't have was a plan for the medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover, the funeral costs that spiraled beyond anything I could have imagined, or the devastating reality that David's contracting business would collapse within months of his death because he was the heart and soul of every client relationship. I watched our comfortable middle-class life evaporate in real time. The house with the white picket fence in Riverside Heights, Connecticut, the one we had saved for years to afford, suddenly felt like a millstone around my neck. The property taxes alone were eating through what remained of our savings like acid through metal. But selling meant uprooting Emma from her senior year of high school, taking Michael away from his friends during the most crucial period of his middle school social development, and admitting to 8-year-old Sophie that Daddy wasn't just gone, but that everything familiar in her world was about to disappear too. So I did what any desperate mother would do. I took every job I could find. I worked as a substitute teacher during the day, cleaned offices at night, and spent weekends doing bookkeeping for small businesses from my laptop while the kids watched Netflix. I learned to make grocery lists based on what was on clearance, to calculate the cost per ounce of everything, to stretch a pound of ground beef into 3 different meals across a week. The Thornfield family went from comfortable to surviving, and I became an expert at hiding it. I learned to smile at school pickup while calculating whether I had enough gas to make it to Friday's payday. I mastered the art of deflecting dinner invitations because I couldn't afford the babysitter, let alone the restaurant. I became fluent in the language of "we're just so busy," when what I really meant was "we're broke and I'm terrified." But somehow, 3 years later, things began to turn around. The bookkeeping clients multiplied through word of mouth until I was running a small accounting practice from my spare bedroom. The life insurance money, carefully invested instead of spent, began to grow. The house that had felt like a burden became an asset as property values in our neighborhood skyrocketed. By year 4 after David's death, we weren't just surviving anymore. We were comfortable again. Not wealthy, but stable. That's when the comments about being out of touch started to really sting. Because I had been in their shoes. I had counted quarters for lunch money. I had lain awake at 3 a.m. wondering how I would pay the electric bill. But now, suggesting that maybe our community could invest in better schools made me the villain, the out-of-touch suburban mom who didn't understand real struggle. The worst part was that I couldn't defend myself without exploiting my own tragedy. How do you say, "Actually, I do understand poverty and loss and desperation," without sounding like you're using your dead husband as a trump card in an argument? How do you explain that your current stability came at the cost of grief so deep it still sometimes takes your breath away when you're folding laundry and find yourself automatically sorting his clothes before remembering they're not there anymore? So I stayed silent, and the accusations of being out of touch multiplied. It wasn't just the Facebook group. It happened at the grocery store when I suggested to another mother that the organic apples were worth the extra dollar for our kids' health. She rolled her eyes and muttered something about "must be nice" under her breath. It happened at Emma's school when I volunteered to coordinate the senior class fundraiser and proposed a higher ticket price for the dinner event. Not everyone can afford $40 a plate, Mrs. Thornfield, the other parent said with barely concealed disgust. It happened at Michael's basketball game when I mentioned that maybe we should invest in better equipment for the team. Some of us are working 2 jobs just to afford the registration fees, another father shot back, as if my suggestion was a personal attack on his financial situation. Each comment chipped away at something inside me, not just my confidence, but my sense of identity. Who was I in this community? Who was I in the world? I had survived devastating loss, rebuilt my life from nothing, created stability for my children, and somehow that made me the enemy. The success I had fought so hard for, the security I had clawed my way back to, had apparently disqualified me from having opinions or making suggestions about our shared community. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March. I was at Sophie's parent-teacher conference, discussing her progress in 3rd grade. Mrs. Patterson, her teacher, mentioned that they were looking for volunteers to help with the spring book fair and suggested that maybe some parents could donate books since the school's budget was so tight. I could donate some books, I offered. Maybe we could create a wish list of titles the kids really want. Another parent, Jessica Morrison, turned to look at me with an expression I had become all too familiar with. "Must be nice to have disposable income for book donations," she said. "Some of us are choosing between groceries and gas money." Something inside me snapped. Not in an explosive way, but like a rubber band that had been stretched too far, finally giving up. I looked at Jessica Morrison with her designer purse and her freshly highlighted hair and her SUV in the parking lot that was newer than mine, and I realized that this wasn't really about money at all. This was about perception. This was about the story people told themselves about who I was, based on how I looked, where I lived, what I suggested. They had created a narrative about Margaret Thornfield, and in their story, I was the privileged suburban mom who had never struggled, never worried about money, never faced real hardship. They couldn't see past the nice house and the put-together appearance to understand that I had earned every single thing I had through loss and work and sacrifice and sleepless nights. But more than that, I realized they didn't want to see it. The narrative of me as out of touch was useful to them. It allowed them to dismiss any suggestion I made without having to engage with the actual merit of the idea. It created an easy target for their frustrations about their own financial situations. It was simpler to attack me than to admit that maybe, just maybe, some of my suggestions actually made sense. That night, after I got home from the school and helped Sophie with her homework and listened to Emma complain about her chemistry teacher and checked on Michael's book report, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and really looked at my life. I looked at the bills spread across the counter that I could actually afford to pay now. I looked at the family photos on the refrigerator, the ones where David's smile seemed to fade a little more each time I glanced at them. I looked at the laptop where I ran my small business, the business that had grown from desperation into something I was actually proud of. I thought about all the things I had learned in the past 6 years, not just about managing money and building a business and raising children alone, but about resilience, community, and the difference between being poor and being broke, between struggling temporarily and being trapped in a cycle of poverty. I thought about the conversations I had with my bookkeeping clients, small business owners and working parents who trusted me with their financial lives and their fears and their dreams. I thought about how many women like me were out there, women who had faced devastating loss and somehow found a way through it, Women who had rebuilt their lives and then been told they were out of touch with real struggle because they had succeeded in creating stability again. Women whose stories of survival were being erased by people who preferred to see them as privileged rather than resilient. And I realized something that changed everything. I wasn't out of touch. They were. They were out of touch with what it really meant to lose everything and build it back up. They were out of touch with the difference between temporary hardship and systemic poverty. They were out of touch with the reality that sometimes the person who suggests spending a little more or investing a little more or trying a little harder isn't speaking from privilege, but from the hard-won knowledge of someone who has been to the bottom and fought their way back up. I opened my laptop and stared at the blank screen for a long time. Then I started typing. My name is Margaret Thornfield, and apparently I'm out of touch with reality. Let me tell you why that's not true, and why the people calling me out of touch might be the ones who really don't understand what's going on in the world. I didn't know what I was going to do with those words. I just knew I needed to say them. I needed to tell my story, not as a victim or as someone seeking sympathy, but as someone who had lived through real hardship and come out the other side with a perspective that apparently threatened people enough to try to silence me. The cursor blinked at the end of that sentence for what felt like hours. Outside, the suburban neighborhood was quiet, filled with families who saw me as the out-of-touch neighbor, the privileged mom who didn't understand their struggles. Inside, I sat with the weight of my real story, the one they had never bothered to ask about, the one that might change everything if I was brave enough to tell it. I had no idea that those first few sentences would eventually become the foundation of something that would reach 500,000 people. I had no idea that my kitchen table would become the launching pad for a journey that would prove once and for all that being called out of touch might actually be the best thing that ever happened to me. But first, I had to find the courage to tell the truth about who I really was, and why their assumptions about me were not just wrong, but dangerous to everyone who had ever been dismissed because they had the audacity to survive and thrive after devastating loss. The notification sound chimed again on my phone. Another comment, probably. Another person ready to tell me how privileged and disconnected I was. This time, instead of letting it keep me awake, I smiled and kept typing. Let them call me out of touch. I was about to show them exactly what being in touch with reality really looked like. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The next morning, I woke up to find 3 pages of typed thoughts on my laptop screen. In the harsh light of 6 a.m., as I rushed to make breakfast and get the kids ready for school, those words seemed almost embarrassing. Who was I kidding? I wasn't a writer. I wasn't a content creator. I was a bookkeeper from Connecticut who had survived some bad years and apparently couldn't handle a few mean comments on Facebook. But something nagged at me as I packed Sophie's lunch and reminded Michael to take his science project to school. The words I had written the night before felt important in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Not because they were particularly brilliant or insightful, but because they were true. And in a world where everyone seemed to be performing a version of themselves online, maybe truth was exactly what was missing. That afternoon, after I finished my client calls and before the kids got home from school, I did something I had never done before. I started researching how to make a YouTube video. I had watched YouTube videos, of course, cooking tutorials when I needed to figure out how to make dinner from whatever was left in the refrigerator during those tight financial years, homework help videos when Emma was struggling with calculus and I was way out of my depth, meditation guides during the worst months of grief when sleep seemed impossible and anxiety felt like a constant companion. But I had never thought about the people behind those videos as real people with real stories. They seemed to exist in some other universe, one where everyone was naturally comfortable on camera and intuitively understood lighting and sound quality and whatever mysterious algorithms determined who got views and who didn't. My first Google search was embarrassingly basic. How to start a YouTube channel. The results were overwhelming. Thousands of articles about equipment and editing software and monetization strategies, and something called search engine optimization that sounded like it required an engineering degree to understand. I clicked on a video titled YouTube for Beginners, Everything You Need to Know. The creator was an enthusiastic 20-something named Tyler, who spoke at roughly twice the speed of a normal human being and kept telling me to smash that like button and don't forget to subscribe. He recommended camera equipment that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month and editing software that apparently required a computer science background to operate. I closed the video feeling more discouraged than ever. This wasn't for me. This was for young people who had grown up with technology, who understood the language of social media, who could afford ring lights and wireless microphones and cameras that cost thousands of dollars. But then I remembered something David used to say when he was building his contracting business. He would come home frustrated after meeting with potential clients who wanted elaborate renovations but balked at the prices. "You know what, Maggie?" he would say, using the nickname only he ever called me. "Sometimes people don't need the fanciest materials or the most expensive fixtures. Sometimes they just need someone who will show up and do good work and tell them the truth about what they actually need." Maybe YouTube was the same way. Maybe people didn't need perfect lighting and professional editing and cameras that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Maybe they just needed someone who would show up and tell them the truth. I started researching different types of YouTube channels, trying to understand what was out there and where a story like mine might fit. There were beauty channels where young women demonstrated makeup techniques I would never have the courage to try. There were gaming channels where people played video games while providing commentary that somehow entertained millions of viewers. There were cooking channels and fitness channels, and channels devoted entirely to people opening packages and reviewing products. But as I dug deeper, I found something else. There were channels run by people who looked more like me. Women in their 40s and 50s who talked about life after divorce, about starting over after career setbacks, about finding purpose in middle age. There were channels about personal finance that didn't assume everyone watching was a 22-year-old just starting their first job. There were channels about grief and loss and rebuilding that spoke to experiences I recognized. The most surprising discovery was a channel called Life After 40, run by a woman named Patricia Hendricks from Portland, Oregon. Patricia was 57, had gone through a devastating divorce after 25 years of marriage, and had started her channel to document her journey of rebuilding her life from scratch. Her videos weren't polished or professional. She filmed them in what appeared to be her small apartment, often while folding laundry or making dinner. But she had over 300,000 subscribers who hung on every word as she talked about everything from learning to live on a single income to dating again after decades of marriage. What struck me about Patricia's channel wasn't just that she was successful, but that her comment sections were filled with women sharing their own stories. Hundreds of women who had been through similar experiences, who found comfort in knowing they weren't alone, who offered advice and support to each other in ways that felt genuine and helpful rather than performative. I spent hours that day reading through those comments. "Thank you for making me feel less alone. I went through something similar, and your videos helped me realize I'm stronger than I thought. You inspired me to finally leave my toxic relationship. Because of your channel, I went back to school at 52, and I'm graduating next month." This wasn't just entertainment. This was a connection. This was a community. This was exactly what had been missing from my interactions with the people in my real-world community who had labeled me as out of touch. Online, Patricia had found a group of people who understood her story, who saw her struggles as valid, who celebrated her successes without resentment. I spent hours that day reading through those comments. "Thank you for making me feel less alone. I went through something similar, and your videos helped me realize I'm stronger than I thought. You inspired me to finally leave my toxic relationship. Because of your channel, I went back to school at 52, and I'm graduating next month." This wasn't just entertainment. This was a connection. This was a community. This was exactly what had been missing from my interactions with the people in my real-world community who had labeled me as out of touch.
Online, Patricia had found a group of people who understood her story, who saw her struggles as valid, who celebrated her successes without resentment. I started taking notes, trying to understand what made Patricia's channel work. Her videos weren't scripted, but they weren't rambling either. She usually focused on one specific topic per video: how I created a budget after divorce, why I started dating again at 55, the biggest mistakes I made while rebuilding my life. She was honest about her failures and setbacks, but she also celebrated her victories in ways that felt inspiring rather than boastful. Most importantly, she never positioned herself as an expert or guru. She positioned herself as someone who was figuring things out in real time and inviting viewers to figure them out alongside her. She asked for advice as often as she gave it, admitted when she was wrong, changed her mind when presented with new information, and treated her audience like intelligent adults who had valuable perspectives to contribute. I found myself wondering what my version of this would look like. What would life after loss, or rebuilding from rock bottom, or the real story of survival sound like coming from me? What would I talk about? What did I have to offer that wasn't already being said by someone else? The answer came to me gradually as I continued my research. Most of the channels I found about overcoming hardship focused on one specific type of struggle: divorce channels, bankruptcy channels, grief channels, job loss channels. But my experience has been more complicated than that. I had dealt with sudden loss, financial devastation, single parenthood, starting a business, and rebuilding a community presence all at the same time. More importantly, I had dealt with the specific challenge of being successful again after failure, and how that success had made me a target for criticism and resentment. I couldn't find anyone talking about what I was starting to think of as survivor's guilt success syndrome, the weird position of being someone who had been through real hardship but was now stable enough to be dismissed as privileged. The challenge of wanting to help your community while being told that your suggestions weren't valid because you had managed to rebuild your life. That evening, after dinner and homework help and bedtime stories, I sat down with my laptop again. But instead of researching other people's channels, I started outlining what mine might look like. I wrote down every assumption people had made about me in the past year: that I had never struggled financially, that I didn't understand what it was like to worry about money, that I was out of touch with the concerns of working families, that my suggestions came from a place of privilege rather than experience. Then I wrote down the reality of my situation: the 3 years of financial terror after David died, the jobs I worked while grieving, the skills I had developed out of desperation, the business I had built from nothing, the perspective I had gained from being at the bottom and fighting my way back up. The contrast was stark. Everything people assumed about me was wrong. But more than that, their assumptions were preventing them from accessing information and perspective that might actually be useful to them. They were so committed to seeing me as privileged that they couldn't hear what I was actually saying.
What if I could show them, not just tell them, but actually demonstrate the reality of what I had been through and what I had learned? What if I could take them behind the scenes of what rebuilding actually looked like, not in some sanitized highlight reel, but in all its messy, complicated, sometimes ugly reality? I started imagining video titles. They called me privileged, but here's what my bank account really looked like after my husband died. The jobs I worked while my kids thought we were fine. How I built a business from my kitchen table while grieving. Why being called out of touch was the wake-up call I needed. The more I thought about it, the more excited I became. This wasn't just about defending myself against unfair accusations. This was about challenging the entire narrative around what struggle looked like, what success meant, and how we talked to each other about money, hardship, and community responsibility. But excitement was quickly followed by terror. Actually making videos would mean putting myself out there in a way I had never done before. It would mean being vulnerable about the worst period of my life. It would mean risking even more criticism and judgment, not just from my local community, but from strangers all over the internet. I thought about Patricia and her hundreds of thousands of subscribers, but I also thought about the negative comments I had seen on her videos, the people who criticized everything from her appearance to her choices to her right to share her story at all. Was I strong enough to handle that?
Did I have the emotional resilience to put my truth out there and face whatever response came back? As I sat there weighing the pros and cons, Sophie appeared in the doorway in her pajamas. "Mom, I can't sleep," she said. "Can you read me another story?" I looked at my 8-year-old daughter, the child who had lost her father and adapted to a completely changed life with more grace than most adults could manage. She had watched me work multiple jobs, start a business, and rebuild our family's stability. She had never heard me complain or blame anyone else for our circumstances. She had learned, without me ever directly teaching her, that sometimes life knocks you down, and the only choice is to get back up and figure out what to do next. What message was I sending her now if I let people silence me because they were uncomfortable with my success? What was I teaching her about standing up for yourself, about telling your truth, about refusing to be diminished by other people's insecurities? "One more story," I said, closing my laptop, "but tomorrow, Mommy is going to start telling a story of her own." As I tucked Sophie back into bed and read her a chapter from her favorite book, I realized I had made my decision. I was going to start that YouTube channel. I was going to tell my story, the real story, the one that would show everyone exactly how wrong they were about who I was and what I had been through. I had no idea if anyone would watch. I had no idea if I would be any good at it. I had no idea if it would change anything, or help anyone, or accomplish any of the things I hoped it might. But I knew one thing for certain. I was done letting other people define who I was. It was time to tell my own story, in my own words, and let the world decide for themselves what to think about Margaret Thornfield. 2 weeks later, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror at 5:30 a.m., trying to figure out if the lighting was good enough to film a YouTube video. I had been putting this off for days, finding every possible excuse to delay what I was starting to think of as the moment of truth. The kids were still asleep, my client work was caught up. I had written and rewritten my first script so many times that I could probably recite it backwards. I had watched approximately 17 different tutorials on how to film yourself with an iPhone. I had downloaded 3 different editing apps and promptly felt overwhelmed by all of them. I had even bought a small tripod from Target after staring at it in the cart for 20 minutes, wondering if spending $12 on something that might turn out to be a complete waste of time was financially responsible. But I was out of excuses. It was time to actually record something. My plan was simple. I would introduce myself, explain why I was starting the channel, and tell the basic story of what had happened after David died. Nothing too dramatic or emotional for the first video. Just the facts, delivered in a calm, reasonable way that would help people understand why their assumptions about me were wrong. I set up my phone on the bathroom counter, angled it toward the mirror, and hit record. Then I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at my own face on the screen, completely forgetting everything I had planned to say. "Hi," I finally managed. "I'm Margaret Thornfield, and I'm starting this channel because—" I stopped. The words I had rehearsed so carefully suddenly seemed stilted and fake. I cleared my throat and tried again. "My name is Margaret Thornfield, and I live in Riverside Heights, Connecticut, and people think I'm out of touch with reality. Better, more honest." I kept going. "They think I'm out of touch because I live in a nice house and I can afford to make suggestions about community spending, and I don't complain about money in public. But what they don't know is that 6 years ago, when my husband died suddenly—" My voice cracked. Not with emotion exactly, but with the weirdness of talking to my phone in my bathroom at dawn about the worst thing that had ever happened to me. I stopped recording and stared at myself in the mirror. This was ridiculous. Who was I kidding? I wasn't a YouTuber. I was a middle-aged bookkeeper who was having some kind of midlife crisis brought on by mean comments on Facebook. Nobody wanted to hear my sob story. Nobody cared about my journey from broke to stable. This whole idea was self-indulgent and embarrassing. But then I heard Michael's alarm go off down the hall, and I knew I had about 30 minutes before the morning chaos started. 30 minutes to either give up on this idea entirely or push through the discomfort and actually create something. I hit the record again. "Take 2, I said to the camera, and then immediately felt stupid for saying it out loud. "Actually, don't mind that. Let me start over." This time, instead of trying to follow my script, I just started talking about the Facebook comment that had kept me awake, about the pattern of being dismissed as privileged whenever I tried to contribute to community discussions, about the frustration of having a survival experience that nobody wanted to acknowledge because it didn't fit their narrative about who I was supposed to be. I talked for almost 15 minutes straight, and by the end, I felt like I had actually said something real. Not polished or perfect, but authentic in a way that my rehearsed script had never been. I was sweaty and my hair was messy, and I had stumbled over words and lost my train of thought multiple times. But it felt true. The problems became apparent when I tried to edit the video. First, the sound was terrible. I hadn't realized how much the bathroom acoustics would affect the audio quality. My voice echoed strangely, and you could hear every little sound: the heating system cycling on, cars driving by outside, even the neighbor's dog barking in the distance.
Second, the lighting changed dramatically as I talked. What had looked fine at 5:30 a.m. looked increasingly harsh and unflattering as the sun came up and started streaming through the bathroom window. By the end of the video, I looked like I was being interrogated under fluorescent lights. Third, I had apparently been swaying back and forth the entire time without realizing it. Watching the playback was like being on a very slow, very boring boat ride. I felt motion sick just looking at myself. But the biggest problem was that I had no idea what I was doing with the editing software. The app I had downloaded seemed designed for people who already understood terms like transitions and color correction and rendering. Every time I tried to trim a section or adjust the audio, I somehow made it worse. After 2 hours of increasingly frustrated attempts, I had managed to turn my 15-minute video into a choppy, barely coherent mess that looked like it had been edited by someone having a seizure. Emma found me at the kitchen table later that morning, staring at my laptop screen with what I'm sure was a look of complete defeat. "What are you working on, Mom?" she asked, grabbing a yogurt from the refrigerator. "Nothing important," I said, closing the laptop quickly. "Just trying to figure out some new software for work." She gave me the look that 17-year-olds reserve for adults who are clearly lying but aren't worth the effort of calling out. "Okay," she said. "Well, I need $20 for the field trip today." As I handed her the money, I realized that this was exactly the problem. Here I was, trying to create content about being dismissed and underestimated, and I couldn't even tell my own daughter what I was doing because I was embarrassed about how badly it was going. That afternoon, I did something that went against every instinct I had developed over the past 6 years of careful financial management. I spent money I wasn't sure I could afford on something that might not work out. I hired someone to help me. Her name was Rebecca Chen, and I found her through a local Facebook group for small business owners. She was 26, had just graduated with a degree in digital media, and was trying to build a freelance editing business. Her rates were reasonable, and more importantly, she seemed patient and willing to work with someone who knew absolutely nothing about video production. "Let me see what you've got so far," Rebecca said when we met at a coffee shop near my house. I showed her the disaster I had created, cringing as she watched my swaying, poorly lit, badly edited attempt at a YouTube video. "Okay," she said when it was over. "The good news is that your story is compelling and you come across as genuine. The bad news is that pretty much everything else needs work." I laughed despite myself. That's what I was afraid of. "But it's all fixable," she continued. "Better location, better lighting, better sound, better editing. And honestly, some of the technical stuff you can learn as you go. The hardest part, having something interesting to say, you've already got figured out." We spent the next hour going through the basics of video creation. Rebecca explained why the bathroom had been a terrible choice. Hard surfaces create echo, small spaces feel claustrophobic on camera, mirrors are distracting. She showed me how to find good natural lighting in my house, the living room window in the afternoon, the kitchen table in the morning. She demonstrated basic iPhone camera settings that I hadn't even known existed. Most importantly, she helped me understand that I didn't need to create something perfect. I just needed to create something better than what I had already done, and then keep improving with each video. "Your first video doesn't have to be amazing," she said. "It just has to exist. You can't get better at something you're not actually doing."
We scheduled a time for her to come to my house the next weekend to help me refilm the introduction video. The plan was simple. She would handle the technical aspects while I focused on just talking honestly about my story. She would teach me the basics of editing so I could handle future videos myself, but for this first one, she would do the heavy lifting. I felt hopeful for the first time since I had started this project. Maybe I actually could do this. Maybe I just needed to accept that I couldn't figure everything out on my own, and that asking for help wasn't a sign of failure. That optimism lasted exactly until Rebecca arrived at my house on Saturday morning. "Where do you want to set up?" she asked, carrying a small bag of equipment that somehow looked more professional than anything I owned. I had spent the week preparing. I had cleaned the living room, moved furniture around to create a good background, and practiced my introduction speech in front of every mirror in the house. I was ready. What I hadn't prepared for was how different it would feel to have another person in the room while I tried to talk about the most difficult period of my life. With Rebecca behind the camera, adjusting lighting and checking sound levels, I suddenly felt like I was performing rather than sharing. Every word seemed calculated, every emotion felt manufactured. The authentic vulnerability I had managed to access in my bathroom disaster was completely gone, replaced by a weird, artificial version of myself that sounded like I was delivering a presentation at a business conference. "Let's try it again," Rebecca said after my third failed attempt. "Maybe just pretend I'm not here?" But I couldn't. I was hyper-aware of her presence, of the professional equipment, of the fact that we were using her time and expertise to create something that might turn out to be completely worthless. The pressure to make it good was overwhelming. After an hour of increasingly stiff and uncomfortable takes, Rebecca put the camera down. "You know what?" she said. "Let's take a break. Tell me why you want to do this. Not for the video, just for me. What's really driving this project?" So I told her about the Facebook comments and the school meetings, the constant feeling of being misunderstood, about the isolation of having survived something difficult and then being punished for surviving it well, about wanting to connect with other people who might be going through similar experiences, but feeling like I couldn't find my community locally. As I talked, Rebecca nodded and asked questions and responded in ways that made me feel heard and understood. For the first time all morning, I relaxed. "That," she said when I finished, "that's what you need to capture on camera. Not a perfect presentation, but that exact conversation we just had." She had an idea. Instead of trying to film a traditional talking head style video, what if we filmed it like a conversation? She would sit off camera, and I would respond naturally, the way I had just done during our break. It worked. Not perfectly. I still stumbled over words and lost my train of thought a few times, but authentically. The video we created that day wasn't polished or professional, but it was real. And real, I was starting to understand, was much more valuable than perfect. 2 days later, I uploaded my first YouTube video. The title was, "They Called Me Out of Touch. Here's My Real Story." The thumbnail was just a simple shot of me sitting at my kitchen table, looking directly at the camera. No fancy graphics or dramatic expressions, just an ordinary middle-aged woman getting ready to tell the truth about her life. I published it at 9:17 p.m. on a Tuesday night, after the kids were asleep and I had finished all my client work. Then, I closed my laptop, brushed my teeth, and went to bed, trying not to think that my personal story was now floating somewhere in the vast ocean of internet content, waiting to be discovered or ignored by strangers who would judge everything from my appearance to my accent to my right to take up space in their digital world. When I woke up the next morning, the video had been viewed 37 times and had received 2 comments. One said, "Thank you for sharing your story." The other said, "You still sound privileged to me." I stared at those comments for a long time, waiting to feel discouraged or angry or vindicated. Instead, I felt something I hadn't expected, curious. Who were these 37 people who had found my video? What had they been searching for? What had they been hoping to find? And more importantly, what did they need to hear next? The analytics dashboard was both fascinating and terrifying. YouTube provided more information about my viewers than I had ever expected or wanted to know.
I could see not just how many people had watched my video, but where they lived, how old they were, what device they used, how long they stayed, and exactly which moments they had skipped or rewatched. After 2 weeks, my first video had accumulated 847 views. To most YouTubers, that probably seemed like nothing, but to me, it represented 847 individual human beings who had chosen to spend 12 minutes of their lives listening to my story. The thought was overwhelming. The comment section had become a source of daily anxiety and fascination. Most were supportive, but the negative ones cut deep. "Stop playing victim," wrote someone named GamerDad2019. "You have a house and a business, cry me a river," said BeachMom77. But for every harsh comment, there were 3 or 4 that said things like, "I needed to hear this today," or "This is exactly what I went through after my divorce." The comment that changed everything came from a woman named Linda Martinez in Phoenix, Arizona. She wrote, "My husband died 2 years ago, and everyone keeps telling me I should be grateful that I got life insurance money. They don't understand that no amount of money makes up for losing your best friend and having to figure out how to be a single parent overnight. Thank you for putting words to something I couldn't explain." I stared at Linda's comment for a long time. Here was someone 1,200 miles away who understood exactly what I had been trying to say. Someone who had lived through the specific hell of being judged for surviving loss too well. Someone who needed to know she wasn't alone in feeling frustrated by other people's assumptions about what grief and recovery should look like. I replied to Linda's comment, and she replied back. Soon, we were having a conversation that felt more honest and meaningful than anything I had experienced with people in my own community in years. Other commenters joined in, sharing their own experiences with loss, judgment, and the complicated process of rebuilding after devastation. That's when I realized what I had been missing. I hadn't started this channel to defend myself against accusations of being out of touch. I had started it to find my people, the other survivors who had been through similar experiences and felt similarly misunderstood. The people who knew the difference between privilege and resilience, between handouts and hard work, between lucky breaks and strategic choices made under pressure. My second video was completely different from the first. Instead of trying to explain my entire story chronologically, I focused on one specific aspect of the rebuilding process: the hidden jobs I had worked while everyone thought I was doing fine. I titled it, "The Jobs I Had That You Never Saw," and filmed it in my car, parked outside the office building where I still cleaned bathrooms 2 nights a week. I had never told anyone about that job. Not my kids, not my neighbors, not even my closest friends. It was a remnant from the desperate years that I had kept as a backup plan, working Tuesday and Thursday evenings after my bookkeeping business was established, just in case everything fell apart again. The extra income wasn't significant anymore, but the psychological security of having multiple revenue streams was worth more than the money. In the video, I explained how I had learned to schedule client calls around my cleaning shifts, how I had developed a completely different persona for each job, how exhausting it was to be successful bookkeeper Margaret during the day and invisible cleaning lady Margaret at night. I talked about the shame I felt about keeping this secret and the fear that revealing it would somehow diminish my credibility in my professional life. The response was immediate and intense. Within 24 hours, the video had more views than my first one had accumulated in 2 weeks. The comment section filled up with stories from other people who had worked multiple jobs while maintaining facades of stability, who had made sacrifices their communities never saw, who understood the specific exhaustion of performing different versions of yourself for different audiences. More importantly, the video attracted attention from people I hadn't expected. Business owners who remembered their own desperate early years, single parents who were currently juggling multiple income streams. Even some of the people from my local community who had dismissed me as privileged began to see me differently. Rebecca Chen called me after watching the second video. "This is it," she said. "This is what you're supposed to be doing. Not explaining yourself, but telling stories that help people feel less alone." She was right. The shift from defensive to connective changed everything about how I approached the channel. Instead of trying to prove that people were wrong about me,
I started focusing on sharing experiences that might resonate with others who felt misunderstood or invisible. My third video was about the skill of invisible budgeting, the financial management techniques I had developed to maintain our lifestyle on a dramatically reduced income without anyone noticing. I filmed it while actually doing my monthly budget at the kitchen table, showing viewers exactly how I allocated every dollar, how I found ways to cut expenses without cutting experiences, how I had learned to be strategic about where we economized and where we maintained appearances. The fourth video was about grief etiquette, the things people said that hurt, the things that helped, and the ways I had learned to navigate social situations where people expected me to be either completely recovered or permanently devastated. I filmed it in the cemetery where David was buried, talking directly about the pressure to perform grief in ways that made other people comfortable. By the fifth video, I had found my rhythm. I was posting once a week, always on Wednesday evenings after the kids were asleep. Each video focused on one specific aspect of the rebuilding experience, told through personal stories, but designed to be useful to anyone going through something similar. The subscriber count started climbing. 500, then 1,000, then 2,500. The comment sections became communities where viewers shared their own experiences and supported each other through difficult times. People started requesting specific topics, sharing their own expertise, and creating connections with each other that extended beyond my videos. But success brought new challenges I hadn't anticipated. The first was time management. Creating weekly videos, responding to comments, and managing the growing administrative aspects of the channel was taking up more hours than I had expected. My bookkeeping business was still my primary income source, and I was struggling to balance both responsibilities without shortchanging my clients or my family. The second was emotional exhaustion. Every video required me to revisit difficult memories and share vulnerable details about the worst period of my life. While the positive response was gratifying, the process of constantly mining my trauma for content was beginning to take a toll on my mental health. The third was criticism from people in my real life who had discovered the channel. Some were supportive, but others seemed threatened. Jessica Morrison, the parent who had criticized me at Sophie's school, left a comment on one of my videos that said, "Easy to play victim when you have a YouTube channel to monetize your sob story." The comment stung, not because it was necessarily true, I hadn't made any money from the channel yet, but because it revealed how some people would always find ways to dismiss or diminish anything I accomplished. No matter how authentic or helpful my content was, there would always be someone ready to reduce it to opportunism or attention-seeking. But for every Jessica Morrison, there were dozens of Linda Martinez's. Women who sent me private messages saying my videos had helped them through difficult divorces, job losses, health crises, and family tragedies. Women who said they had started their own businesses after watching my content about entrepreneurship after loss. Women who had found the courage to leave toxic relationships, pursue delayed dreams, or simply ask for help when they needed it. The turning point came when I received a message from a woman named Carol Stevens in Minneapolis. She was 54, had lost her job during a corporate restructuring, and was facing foreclosure on her home. She had been following my channel for 3 months and had implemented several of the financial strategies I had shared. More importantly, she said, watching her videos had helped her understand that losing everything doesn't mean she was a failure. It just meant she was having a different kind of human experience that required different skills.
I used to be embarrassed about my situation, Carol wrote. I felt like I had done something wrong, like I should be ashamed of needing help. Your channel helped me realize that sometimes life just happens, and the only shame is in not doing everything you can to rebuild. I'm working 3 part-time jobs now, and instead of feeling sorry for myself, I feel proud of my resourcefulness. You helped me see my situation as a challenge to overcome rather than a failure to hide. Carol's message made me realize that I had found something I hadn't even known I was looking for: purpose. Not just the satisfaction of building something successful, but the knowledge that the worst experiences of my life could be transformed into resources that helped other people navigate similar challenges. 6 months after publishing my first video, my channel had grown to over 15,000 subscribers. The growth was steady rather than explosive, but it was consistent. More importantly, it was meaningful. These weren't random viewers who had stumbled across my content by accident. These were people who were actively seeking the kind of perspective and community I was offering. I started getting messages from viewers who wanted to share their own stories on the channel. Women who had started businesses after loss, rebuilt their finances after divorce, or created new identities after major life changes. The idea of featuring other people's experiences excited me. It would take some of the pressure off me to constantly generate content from my own life, and it would provide my audience with a wider range of perspectives and strategies. My first guest video featured Patricia Martinez, a 48-year-old teacher from San Antonio who had started a successful tutoring business after being laid off from her school district. We filmed the interview over video call, and I was amazed by how natural the conversation felt. Patricia shared strategies I had never considered, perspectives that differed from mine in important ways, and stories that complemented rather than repeated the content I had already created. The guest video performed better than any of my solo content had. The comments section filled up with viewers thanking both of us for the conversation, sharing their own experiences with career transitions, and requesting more interviews with women who had rebuilt their lives in different ways. I realized I had stumbled onto something bigger than just my own story. There was a whole community of women who had been through major life changes, developed resilience and resourcefulness in the process, and then been dismissed or misunderstood because their success didn't fit conventional narratives about struggle and recovery. These were women who had been called out of touch, privileged, or lucky, when the reality was that they had survived difficult circumstances through intelligence, hard work, and strategic decision-making. They had stories worth telling, wisdom worth sharing, and perspectives that could help others navigate similar challenges. As I sat in my kitchen that evening, looking at the analytics dashboard that showed viewers from 43 different states and 12 different countries, I realized that being called out of touch had been the best thing that had ever happened to me. Not because the criticism was fair or accurate, but because it had forced me to articulate my own truth in ways that resonated with people who needed to hear it. I wasn't out of touch. I had just been talking to the wrong audience. Online, I had found my people, and apparently, there were a lot more of us than I had ever imagined. The video that changed everything wasn't supposed to be a video at all. It was a Thursday morning in November, exactly 8 months after I had published my first YouTube video. I was rushing to get the kids ready for school while simultaneously trying to finish a client's quarterly report before my 10 a.m. deadline. Michael couldn't find his science textbook, Sophie was having a meltdown about wearing her winter coat, and Emma was complaining that we were out of the expensive granola bars she liked for breakfast. In the middle of this chaos, my phone started buzzing with notifications. Not the usual trickle of comments and subscriber alerts I had grown accustomed to, but a steady stream of alerts that seemed to be accelerating by the minute. I ignored them until I dropped the kids off at school and finally had a chance to check what was happening. My most recent video, Why I Don't Feel Sorry for My Success Anymore, had somehow accumulated over 50,000 views overnight. By the time I pulled into my driveway, it was approaching 75,000. This was unprecedented. My most popular video to date had peaked at around 8,000 views. Something had definitely changed, but I had no idea what or why. The video itself had been fairly standard for my channel. I had filmed it the previous Sunday evening, talking about the psychological shift that had happened when I stopped apologizing for rebuilding my life successfully. I discussed the guilt I had initially felt about having money again, about being able to afford things that some of my neighbors couldn't, about moving from survival mode back into stability without losing sight of how precarious everything could be. It was personal and vulnerable, but not dramatically different from dozens of other videos I had created. The only unusual thing was that I had ended it with a challenge to viewers. Stop apologizing for surviving well. Stop letting other people make you feel guilty for figuring things out. And definitely stop pretending to struggle more than you actually are just to make other people comfortable. Apparently, that message had struck a nerve. The comment section was unlike anything I had ever seen on my channel. Instead of the usual mix of supportive messages and occasional criticism, there were hundreds of comments from people sharing their own experiences with survivor's guilt, success shaming, and the pressure to downplay their achievements to avoid making others feel bad. "I've been pretending I can't afford things so my friends won't resent me," wrote someone named Sarah_K 2019. "I realize now that I'm not helping anyone by lying about my situation."
My family makes me feel guilty every time we go on vacation because my siblings are struggling. But we worked our asses off to be able to afford these trips. Why should we apologize for that? I got promoted at work and haven't told my friends because they always make comments about how some people have all the luck. Maybe it wasn't luck. Maybe it was staying late every day for 2 years and taking on projects nobody else wanted. But what really accelerated the video's reach was when it got shared by someone with a much larger platform than mine. Dr. Angela Rodriguez was a financial therapist with over 200,000 followers across various social media platforms. She had built her reputation helping people understand the psychological aspects of money management, particularly the emotional blocks that prevented people from building wealth and financial security. She shared my video on her Instagram story with the caption, "This woman is speaking the truth that nobody wants to hear. We've created a culture where success is suspicious and struggle is the only acceptable narrative. Watch this and ask yourself, who does it serve when we make successful people apologize for their achievements?" Her endorsement sent thousands of new viewers to my video, but more importantly, it introduced my content to an audience of people who were actively interested in the intersection of psychology, money, and personal development. These weren't just people looking for survival stories or emotional support. These were people looking for practical strategies and permission to pursue their own success without guilt or apology.
Within 48 hours, the video had been viewed over 200,000 times. My subscriber count jumped from 23,000 to 41,000. My phone was buzzing constantly with notifications, messages, and interview requests from podcasters and bloggers who wanted to discuss the themes I had raised. The experience was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. For months, I had been building a small but engaged community of women who understood each other's experiences with loss, rebuilding, and judgment. Suddenly, I was dealing with a much larger and more diverse audience that included people with very different perspectives on success, struggle, and social responsibility. Some of the new attention was wonderful. I received messages from successful women who had been hiding their achievements, entrepreneurs who had been downplaying their businesses to avoid seeming boastful, and working mothers who had been pretending to be more overwhelmed than they actually were to fit in with friends who were genuinely struggling. But with a larger audience came more intense criticism. People who had never seen my content before were judging the viral video in isolation, without understanding the context of my story or the community I had built. Some accused me of promoting selfishness and lack of empathy. Others suggested I was encouraging people to abandon friends and family members who were less fortunate. The criticism that stung the most came from a woman named Jennifer Walsh, who had written a lengthy blog post titled "The Problem with Margaret Thornfield's Success Gospel." In it, she argued that my message was tone-deaf and potentially harmful, that it ignored systemic inequality and individual circumstances beyond people's control. Thornfield's message essentially boils down to stop feeling bad about having more than other people, Walsh wrote. But this ignores the reality that many people's struggles are not temporary setbacks that can be overcome through hard work and positive thinking. Some people face systemic barriers, chronic health issues, family obligations, and other circumstances that make the kind of rebuilding Thornfield describes impossible. I read Walsh's critique multiple times, trying to understand her perspective and evaluate whether her criticisms were valid. She wasn't entirely wrong. I had been speaking primarily from my own experience and the experiences of women in similar situations. I hadn't addressed systemic inequality, racial discrimination, disability, or other factors that could make rebuilding much more complicated than my personal journey had been. But I also felt like Walsh was mischaracterizing my message. I had never suggested that everyone could or should follow my exact path. I had simply shared my own experience and encouraged people not to apologize for their success when they did achieve it. Those were very different things. The controversy, unfortunately, only accelerated the video's reach. Within a week, it had been viewed over 500,000 times and had been shared, criticized, defended, and dissected across multiple platforms. I was getting interview requests from major podcasts, speaking opportunities at conferences, and business propositions from companies that wanted to sponsor my content.
I was also getting hate mail. The messages ranged from mildly critical to genuinely threatening. People accused me of being everything from a privileged white woman who didn't understand real struggle to a heartless capitalist who was encouraging people to abandon their communities. Some of the messages were so vicious that I started screening my email and turned off direct messages on my social media accounts. The stress was affecting my family in ways I hadn't anticipated. Emma was getting questions at school about my controversial videos. Michael was embarrassed when his friends found out his mom was YouTube famous. Sophie was confused about why strangers on the internet were saying mean things about me. The worst part was that the negative attention was also affecting my local community relationships, which had been slowly improving as people got to know me through my content. Now, with national attention on the video, some of my neighbors who had previously warmed up to me were back to viewing me with suspicion and resentment. One evening, as I was dealing with a particularly nasty batch of comments, Rebecca Chen called to check on me. "How are you handling all this?" she asked. "I'm not sure I am," I admitted. I went from having a small, supportive community to being in the middle of a national conversation about success and privilege. I don't know if I'm qualified for this level of attention. "Nobody is until it happens," Rebecca said. "But you have a choice about what you do next. You can let the controversy define your channel, or you can use this platform to have more nuanced conversations about the things people are actually concerned about." She was right. The viral video had given me a much larger audience, but it had also revealed gaps in my perspective that I needed to address. Instead of retreating or becoming defensive, I could use this opportunity to learn from the criticism and expand the scope of what I was discussing. My next video was titled "What I Got Wrong About Success and Struggle." In it, I addressed some of the valid criticisms that had been raised about my viral video. I acknowledged that my experience as a white, educated, middle-class woman had provided me with advantages that not everyone has. I talked about the difference between temporary setbacks and systemic barriers, between individual resilience and structural inequality. Most importantly, I clarified what I had been trying to say in the first place, that people who had overcome difficult circumstances shouldn't be shamed for their success, but that didn't mean they should be indifferent to others who are still struggling. "I'm not saying don't help people who are having a hard time," I explained to the camera. "I'm saying don't let other people make you feel guilty for having figured out how to help yourself. There's a difference between being selfish and being self-preserving. There's a difference between abandoning your community and refusing to diminish yourself to make others comfortable." The response to this follow-up video was more measured, but ultimately more meaningful than the viral video had been. While it didn't get the same explosive number of views, it generated thoughtful conversations about how successful people could maintain empathy and social responsibility without sacrificing their own achievements or mental health. More importantly, it attracted the attention of people who were interested in having nuanced conversations about success, community, and individual responsibility. These viewers became the foundation of what would eventually become a much more sophisticated and impactful channel. 3 weeks after the viral moment, I received a message that changed my entire perspective on what I was building. It came from Dr. Maria Santos, a sociology professor at Columbia University who specialized in women's economic empowerment. "I've been following your channel since your video went viral," she wrote. "I think you're touching on something really important about the relationship between individual success and community responsibility. I'm wondering if you'd be interested in collaborating on some content that explores these themes more deeply. I think there's an opportunity here to move beyond personal storytelling into broader social commentary." Dr. Santos's message made me realize that I had accidentally stumbled into a much larger conversation about women, money, success, and society. The viral video hadn't just brought me a bigger audience, it had revealed that there was a genuine appetite for serious discussions about topics that most people only addressed in academic circles or private conversations. As I sat in my kitchen that evening, looking at subscriber numbers that had stabilized around 65,000, I realized that the viral moment hadn't just changed the size of my audience, it had changed the possibilities for what my channel could become. I was no longer just telling my story or building a support community for women who had been through similar experiences. I was potentially becoming a voice in broader cultural conversations about success, struggle, and what we owe each other as members of society. The question was I ready for that level of responsibility? And more importantly, was I smart enough to handle it well?
The collaboration with Dr. Maria Santos changed everything about how I approached my channel. What started as a simple interview about women's economic empowerment evolved into a monthly series we called Real Talk About Money and Success. Maria brought academic rigor to conversations I had been having instinctively. She helped me understand the broader social and economic forces that shaped individual experiences like mine. More importantly, she taught me how to discuss complex topics without losing the personal authenticity that had made my channel successful in the first place. Our first collaborative video, Why We Shame Successful Women and How It Hurts Everyone, became my second viral hit. Within 2 weeks, it had accumulated over 300,000 views and sparked discussions on financial podcasts, women's forums, and even a segment on a national morning show. But the real breakthrough came when we started featuring diverse guests who had rebuilt their lives under different circumstances than mine. Teresa Johnson, a Black single mother from Detroit who had started a successful catering business after losing her factory job. Amy Liu, a disabled entrepreneur who had built a 6-figure consulting practice despite chronic health challenges. Rosa Mendez, an immigrant who had created financial stability for her family through real estate investing while working 2 jobs and raising 3 children. These women's stories were different from mine in important ways, but they shared common themes: resilience in the face of setbacks, strategic thinking under pressure, and the frustration of being dismissed or underestimated by people who didn't understand their journeys. The channel's subscriber count climbed steadily, 75,000, then 100,000, then 150,000. But more importantly, the quality of engagement was unlike anything I had experienced before. Viewers weren't just consuming content, they were starting businesses, having difficult conversations with family members, making financial decisions they had been avoiding, and supporting each other through major life transitions. The comment sections became resource centers where people shared job leads, business advice, and emotional support. Viewers started organizing local meetups in major cities. Some formed investment clubs or business partnerships after connecting through my videos. I realized I wasn't just running a YouTube channel anymore. I was accidentally facilitating a movement of women who were determined to succeed without apologizing for it, while still maintaining their values and connections to their communities. The milestone that made this real was reaching 200,000 subscribers on a Tuesday in March, exactly 18 months after I had published my first video. YouTube sent me a Silver Play Button award, a physical reminder that what had started as a response to Facebook comments had become something much larger than I had ever imagined. That evening, I called my sister Rachel in California, someone I hadn't talked to much since David died because our conversations always felt strained and uncomfortable. "I saw your channel hit 200,000 subscribers," she said. "Mom sent me the link to your latest video." I held my breath, waiting for the criticism or dismissal I had grown accustomed to from people in my personal life. "I owe you an apology," Rachel continued. "After David died, I thought you were handling everything too well. I thought you were pretending to be stronger than you actually were, and it made me feel like you didn't need support from the family. Watching your videos, I realized I completely misunderstood what you were going through." The conversation with Rachel revealed something I hadn't fully understood before. The same qualities that had made strangers call me out of touch had made my own family members think I didn't need their help. My competence had been misinterpreted as indifference. My strength had been seen as a rejection of vulnerability. "I was drowning," I told Rachel, "but I was drowning quietly because I thought asking for help would make everyone else panic. I thought I had to hold everything together for the kids, for David's memory, for everyone who was watching to see if I would fall apart." "You should have told us," she said. "I tried to," I replied, "but every time I mentioned how hard things were, someone would say something like, 'At least you got life insurance,' or 'At least the house is paid off,' or 'At least you have your health.' It felt like there was no space for me to struggle because other people thought my situation could have been worse." That conversation helped me understand why my YouTube channel had resonated with so many people. We lived in a culture that had very narrow definitions of what struggle looked like and who was allowed to claim difficulty.
If you had certain advantages, education, savings, family support, good health, people expected you to handle hardship gracefully and privately. But real life was messier than that. You could be grateful for your advantages and still find your circumstances overwhelming. You could acknowledge your privilege and still need support. You could be successful in rebuilding your life and still carry trauma from what you had lost. My channel had become a place where people could tell the whole truth about their experiences, not just the parts that made others comfortable. The business opportunities that came with 200,000 subscribers were both exciting and overwhelming. Companies wanted to sponsor my videos, publishers wanted me to write a book, conference organizers wanted me to give keynote speeches, podcasts wanted me as a regular guest. For the first time since starting the channel, I was faced with decisions that could significantly impact my family's financial future. The sponsorship deals alone could replace my bookkeeping income entirely. The speaking engagements could provide more money in a weekend than I had previously made in a month. But I was terrified of compromising the authenticity that had made the channel successful. Every opportunity seemed to come with the risk of becoming exactly the kind of out-of-touch influencer I had criticized in other contexts. The solution came from an unexpected source, my viewers themselves. I posted a community update video explaining the opportunities I was considering and asking for feedback about how to handle them without losing the community we had built together. The response was overwhelmingly thoughtful and supportive. "Take the opportunities that align with your values," wrote longtime subscriber Jennifer Phoenix AZ. "We trust you to make good decisions because you've been making them in front of us for months." "Don't feel guilty about making money from helping people," commented Business Mom Seattle. "You've provided value to all of us. It's okay to be compensated for that value." "Just keep being real with us," said Rebuild After 50. "We can tell the difference between authentic Margaret and performer Margaret. As long as you stay authentic, Margaret, we'll keep watching." Their feedback helped me develop criteria for evaluating opportunities. I would only work with companies whose products or services I actually used and believed in. I would only speak at events where I could tell my real story without sanitizing it for corporate audiences. I would only write a book if I could maintain editorial control over the content. Most importantly, I would continue to prioritize my viewers' needs over potential revenue. The money was nice, but the community was irreplaceable. 6 months later, I published my first book, Out of Touch: What I Learned About Success, Struggle, and Community After Being Called Privileged. It became a bestseller, not because of celebrity endorsements or massive marketing campaigns, but because 200,000 YouTube subscribers told their friends and family to read it. The book tour was surreal. I spoke at venues across the country to audiences who already knew my story intimately. Instead of traditional book readings, the events became community conversations where attendees shared their own experiences with loss, rebuilding, and social judgment. At a bookstore in Portland, a woman raised her hand during the Q&A session and said, "I want to thank you for teaching me that I don't have to struggle to maintain friendships. I've been pretending to be worse off than I am because I was afraid my friends would resent my success. After watching your channel, I finally told them the truth about how well my business is doing. Instead of being angry, they asked for advice about starting businesses of their own." Stories like that reminded me why I had started the channel in the first place. Not to become famous or make money or prove that critics were wrong about me, but to create space for honest conversations about experiences that people usually handle in isolation. By the end of the book tour, my channel had grown to over 350,000 subscribers. But more importantly, it had spawned a network of related channels, local meetup groups, business partnerships, and friendships that extended far beyond my individual content. What had started as one middle-aged woman defending herself against accusations of being out of touch had become a movement of people who were determined to tell the truth about their lives, regardless of who felt uncomfortable with that truth. As I sat in my kitchen late one evening, responding to emails from viewers who had started their own businesses, left toxic relationships, or simply learned to stop apologizing for their success, I realized that being called out of touch had been the greatest gift anyone had ever given me. It had forced me to examine my own assumptions, connect with people who shared my experiences, and ultimately build something that was helping thousands of people live more authentically. I was no longer the woman who stayed quiet to avoid making others uncomfortable. I was the woman who had found her voice and used it to help others find theirs.
The notification arrived on a Wednesday morning, exactly 2 years and 3 months after I had published my first video. My channel has reached 500,000 subscribers. 500,000 people had chosen to follow my journey from defensive widow to accidentally influential voice in conversations about success, authenticity, and community responsibility. The number felt simultaneously massive and meaningless. Massive because I could never have imagined that a response to Facebook criticism would reach so many people. Meaningless because the real impact wasn't in the subscriber count. It was in the individual transformations happening in comment sections, private messages, and real-world meetups across the country. That same morning, I received an email that brought the journey full circle in the most unexpected way. "Dear Mrs. Thornfield," it began, "my name is Jessica Morrison, and I believe we know each other from our children's school. I owe you an apology that's about 2 years overdue." I stared at the screen, remembering Jessica as the parent who had criticized me at Sophie's parent-teacher conference, the one who had accused me of having disposable income when I offered to donate books to the school library. The woman whose dismissive comments had been part of the pattern that eventually drove me to create the channel in the first place. "I've been watching your YouTube channel for the past 6 months," her email continued. "I had no idea who you were when I first came across your videos. I found them through a financial planning group I joined on Facebook. It wasn't until I saw you mention Riverside Heights Elementary that I realized you were the same Margaret Thornfield I had been so judgmental toward." She went on to explain that she had been struggling with her own feelings of inadequacy and financial insecurity when she had lashed out at me. Her husband had been unemployed for 8 months, and she had been working double shifts as a nurse while trying to maintain the appearance that everything was fine. Seeing me make suggestions that seemed to come from a place of financial comfort had triggered her own shame and frustration. "Watching your videos helped me understand that you weren't trying to show off or make anyone feel bad," she wrote. "You were just sharing ideas from your own experience. More importantly, your content helped me realize that I was making myself miserable by pretending our situation wasn't as difficult as it actually was. I've started being more honest about our struggles, and it's amazing how much support we've received once people knew we needed help." Jessica's apology was gracious and thoughtful, but what struck me most was how she had transformed her own relationship with struggle and success. She had started a small business providing home healthcare services, was building financial stability for her family, and was no longer apologizing for either her previous difficulties or her current improvements. "I want to thank you for showing me that there's a difference between being tone-deaf and being hopeful," she concluded. "Your suggestions weren't insensitive. They were based on the belief that difficult situations could be improved. I needed to hear that, even if I wasn't ready to hear it at the time." I replied to Jessica's email, and we arranged to meet for coffee the following weekend. The conversation was surreal. Sitting across from someone who had unknowingly played such a pivotal role in my journey, discussing how we had both been changed by experiences neither of us could have predicted. "I feel like I should apologize for accidentally inspiring your YouTube career," Jessica said, laughing. "Don't apologize," I replied. "You gave me exactly what I needed, even though neither of us knew it at the time." Our conversation led to Jessica becoming a guest on my channel, sharing her own story of transformation from defensive criticism to entrepreneurial action. The video, titled "When the Person Who Called You Out of Touch Becomes Your Biggest Fan," became one of my most popular, demonstrating the possibility for growth and understanding even in relationships that begin with conflict and misunderstanding. But Jessica's transformation was just one example of how the channel had created ripple effects I never could have anticipated. Over the past 2 years, I had received thousands of messages from viewers who had made major life changes after engaging with my content. Women who had started businesses, ended toxic relationships, pursued delayed education, relocated for better opportunities, and most importantly, stopped hiding their successes to make others comfortable. The most profound example came from a viewer named Catherine Williams in Baltimore, who had been following my channel since my third video. Catherine was 57, had been widowed for 4 years, and had spent those years convinced that she was too old to rebuild her life in any meaningful way. "I was existing, not living," she wrote in a message that accompanied a video she had created for my monthly viewer spotlight series.
I had convinced myself that at my age, after losing my husband, the best I could hope for was to maintain what I had and not be a burden to my adult children. Catherine's video documented her transformation over 18 months of watching my channel. She had started by implementing small financial strategies I had shared, then progressed to taking a real estate course, and eventually launched a successful property management business that now employed 3 other women over 50. Margaret's channel didn't just give me practical advice, Catherine explained in her video. It gave me permission to want more from my life. It showed me that rebuilding after loss wasn't selfish or unrealistic. It was possible and necessary. Catherine's business had generated enough income to allow her daughter buy her first home and to establish a scholarship fund for widowed women pursuing business education. Her success had created opportunities for others in ways that multiplied the positive impact far beyond her individual achievement. Stories like Catherine's helped me understand that the channel had evolved into something much larger than personal storytelling or even community building. It had become a catalyst for economic and social change, particularly among women who had been marginalized or underestimated because of their age, their personal circumstances, or their refusal to perform struggle in ways that others comfortable. The milestone of reaching 500,000 subscribers coincided with an opportunity that would test everything I had learned about maintaining authenticity while expanding impact. Netflix approached me about creating a documentary series based on my book and channel, following women who had rebuilt their lives after major setbacks.
The project was both thrilling and terrifying. Netflix had the resources to reach millions of people, but they also had their own agenda and creative vision that might not align with the values that had made my channel successful. I spent weeks in meetings with producers, trying to understand whether they wanted to tell authentic stories about resilience and transformation, or whether they wanted to create entertainment that simplified complex experiences for mass consumption. The turning point came when I insisted that any women featured in the series would have creative control over how their stories were told. I had learned from my YouTube community that authenticity couldn't be manufactured or directed. It could only emerge when people felt safe to tell the truth about their experiences. Real Stories Women Who Rebuild premiered 8 months later to critical acclaim and massive viewership. But more importantly, it introduced the themes and conversations from my channel to audiences who might never have found my content otherwise. The series sparked national discussions about widowhood, financial recovery, entrepreneurship after 50, and the ways society underestimates women's capacity for reinvention. The documentary also revealed how my personal journey had intersected with broader social and economic trends. The producers had done research showing that women over 40 were starting businesses at higher rates than any other demographic, despite facing significant obstacles in accessing capital, mentorship, and market recognition. My story wasn't unique. It was part of a massive wave of women who were refusing to accept limited expectations about what their lives could become after major transitions. The success of the Netflix series brought my subscriber count to over 750,000, but it also brought opportunities and responsibilities that forced me to make decisions about the future of my platform. Publishing houses wanted me to write more books. Speaking agencies wanted to book me for corporate events. Investment firms wanted me to launch financial products for my audience. Each opportunity represented a choice between growth and integrity, between reach and authenticity, between influence and exploitation. I had seen too many content creators lose their way when they prioritized scale over substance, and I was determined not to repeat their mistakes. The solution came from revisiting the original purpose of the channel, creating space for honest conversations about experiences that people usually handled in isolation. Instead of expanding into areas where I lacked expertise or passion, I decided to deepen my focus on the intersection of personal transformation and community building. I launched the Rebuild Community, a membership platform that connected women going through major life transitions with mentors, resources, and each other. Rather than trying to scale my individual reach, I created infrastructure for peer-to-peer support and learning. The community included business incubators for women over 40, financial literacy programs designed specifically for people rebuilding after loss, and local chapters that organized in-person support and networking.
The Rebuild community grew to over 50,000 members in its first year, generating enough revenue to support a small staff and provide scholarships for women who couldn't afford membership fees. Most importantly, it created sustainable support systems that didn't depend on my individual content creation or charismatic leadership. On the third anniversary of my first video, I published a reflection piece titled "What I've Learned About Being Out of Touch with Reality." Instead of celebrating subscriber milestones or business achievements, I focused on the personal transformations that had made everything else possible. 3 years ago, I thought being called out of touch was an insult, I said to the camera, sitting in the same kitchen where I had written my first angry response to Facebook critics. Now I understand it was an invitation to examine my assumptions, connect with people who shared my experiences, and ultimately build something that helps others navigate similar challenges. I talked about how the process of creating content had forced me to articulate ideas I had never fully formed, to examine my own privilege and limitations, and to learn from people whose experiences differed significantly from mine. I discussed how building a community had taught me the difference between influence and impact, between being heard and being helpful. Most importantly, I addressed the question that people asked me most frequently: whether I regretted the loss and hardship that had led to the channel's creation. I wouldn't choose to lose David again, I said. I wouldn't choose to go through financial devastation or social judgment or any of the difficult experiences that brought me to this point. But I also can't regret the person those experiences helped me become, or the community they helped me build, or the conversations they enabled me to have. As I finished recording that anniversary video, I realized that the journey from out of touch to 500,000 subscribers was less about vindication and more about transformation. The people who had initially criticized me hadn't been entirely wrong. I had been somewhat isolated from certain realities and perspectives. But instead of becoming defensive about their criticism, I had used it as motivation to expand my understanding and connect more authentically with a broader community. The channel had grown from a response to local Facebook drama into a platform that reached people across the globe who were navigating loss, rebuilding after setbacks, and refusing to apologize for their resilience. The subscriber count was just a number, but the conversations happening in comment sections, the businesses being started by viewers, the relationships being formed through community meetups, and the cultural shifts happening around how we discuss success and struggle, those were the real measures of impact. That evening, after publishing the anniversary video, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and opened my laptop to respond to comments and messages. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma, now a college freshman studying business and communications. "Just watched your anniversary video, Mom," she wrote. "I'm proud of how you turned something that hurt you into something that helps other people. You taught me that the best response to criticism is to prove people wrong by becoming better, not by arguing with them." As I read Emma's message, I realized that the most important legacy of the channel wasn't the subscriber count or the business success or even the community we had built. It was the example I had set for my children about how to respond to setbacks, criticism, and unexpected challenges with resilience, authenticity, and determination to help others. The journey from being called out of touch to reaching 500,000 subscribers had taken 3 years, countless hours of work, and more vulnerability than I had ever thought possible. But it had also created something unprecedented, a platform where women could tell the truth about their experiences without apology, where success was celebrated rather than resented, and where the messiness of real life was acknowledged and supported rather than hidden and judged. I was no longer the woman who stood silent to avoid conflict or the woman who apologized for surviving well. I was the woman who had found her voice, used it to help others find theirs, and built a community that would continue growing and evolving long after I stopped making videos. They had called me out of touch, and they had been right in ways they never intended. I had been out of touch with my own power, with my community of peers, and with the possibility that my worst experiences could become resources for helping others navigate similar challenges. Now I was very much in touch, with 500,000 people who trusted me with their stories, with a community that supported each other through transitions and transformations, and with the knowledge that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is having someone challenge your assumptions about who you are and what you're capable of becoming. The notification sound chimed on my phone. Another comment, another message, another person finding their way to our corner of the internet where being successful after struggle wasn't something to apologize for, but something to celebrate and share. I smiled and kept typing. 5 months after reaching the 500,000 milestone, something extraordinary happened that proved the true power of what we had built together. I received an email from Dr. Lisa Hendricks, the Dean of Women's Studies at Northwestern University, inviting me to deliver the keynote address at their annual symposium on women's economic empowerment in the digital age.
The invitation felt surreal. 3 years earlier, I had been a bookkeeper from Connecticut whose biggest platform was the local Facebook neighborhood group. Now, I was being asked to address academics, researchers, and policymakers about subjects I had learned not from textbooks, but from lived experience and thousands of conversations with women navigating similar challenges. The symposium speech became a defining moment, not because of the academic recognition, but because of what happened afterward. In the audience was Senator Patricia Walsh from Illinois, who approached me during the reception with a proposal that would expand the impact beyond anything I had imagined. "Mrs. Thornfield," she said, "I've been following your work since the Netflix documentary aired. I'm currently drafting legislation to support women entrepreneurs over 45, particularly those who are starting businesses after major life transitions, like divorce, widowhood, or career displacement. Would you be willing to testify before Congress about the barriers these women face and the support systems they need?" The request was both honor and responsibility. Testifying before Congress meant representing not just my own experience, but the experiences of hundreds of thousands of women who had shared their stories through my platform. It meant translating personal narratives into policy recommendations, individual struggles into systemic solutions. I spent weeks preparing for the testimony, working with Dr. Maria Santos and other experts to ensure that my personal observations were supported by data and research. We analyzed patterns from the thousands of stories shared through my channel and the Rebuild community, identifying common obstacles and successful strategies that could inform legislative solutions. The day of the testimony arrived in early September, almost exactly 3 years after I had published my first video. Sitting at the witness table in the Capitol building, looking out at senators and representatives who would make decisions affecting millions of women, I thought about how impossible this moment would have seemed during those desperate years after David's death. "Senators, my name is Margaret Thornfield," I began, "and 3 years ago, my neighbors called me out of touch with reality because I suggested our community could afford to invest more in our children's education. Today, I'm here representing 500,000 women who refuse to apologize for rebuilding their lives successfully after devastating setbacks." The testimony lasted 45 minutes, during which I shared not just my own story, but the stories of women like Katherine Williams, Teresa Johnson, and dozens of others who had transformed their lives through entrepreneurship, education, and community support. I presented data showing that women over 45 were starting businesses at unprecedented rates, despite facing significant obstacles in accessing capital, mentorship, and market recognition. More importantly, I advocated for policy changes that could remove some of those barriers, expanded access to microloans, tax incentives for businesses that provided mentorship to older women entrepreneurs, and funding for programs that helped women develop digital literacy and online marketing skills. The senators' questions revealed both genuine interest and frustrating misconceptions. Some wanted to know how to scale successful programs. Others seemed skeptical that government intervention was necessary, suggesting that individual determination should be sufficient for success. Senator Margaret Chen from California asked the question that allowed me to address the heart of the matter. "Mrs. Thornfield, what would you say to critics who argue that successful women like yourself don't need additional support, that resources should be focused on those who are still struggling?" "Senator," I replied, "that question reveals exactly the problem we're trying to solve. The assumption that success eliminates the need for community support creates isolation and prevents the sharing of knowledge and resources that could help more women succeed. When we support women who are rebuilding successfully, we create models and mentors for others facing similar challenges. Success should be multiplied, not penalized."
The response from my YouTube community to the congressional testimony was overwhelming. The video of my testimony, which I posted on my channel, became my most viewed content ever, reaching over 2 million views in its first month. But more importantly, it sparked action from viewers across the country who contacted their own representatives, shared their stories with local media, and organized advocacy efforts in their communities. The legislation that emerged, called the Women's Second Chapter Economic Opportunity Act, incorporated many of the recommendations from my testimony and the experiences shared by my community. When it passed 6 months later with bipartisan support, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment that went far beyond personal achievement. We had transformed individual stories of struggle and success into systemic change that would benefit women for generations. The policy victory attracted international attention to the broader movement we had accidentally created. I received invitations to speak in Canada, Australia, and the UK about women's economic empowerment after life transitions. The Rebuild community expanded internationally, with chapters forming in major cities across 3 continents. But perhaps the most meaningful development was what started happening in my own community of Riverside Heights, Connecticut. The same neighbors who had once dismissed me as out of touch with reality began approaching me differently. Not because they were intimidated by my platform or success, but because they finally understood the experiences that had shaped my perspectives. The local library invited me to host a monthly workshop series called Second Chapters, where community members could discuss major life transitions, financial planning, and entrepreneurship. The sessions attracted not just women facing challenges, but also successful professionals who wanted to give back and people who were curious about different approaches to resilience and rebuilding. One evening, as I was setting up for a workshop about starting over at your lost, Jessica Morrison arrived early to help arrange chairs. "I never thought I'd say this," she said, laughing, "but you've become exactly the kind of community resource I wish I'd had access to during our difficult years. You were offering help all along. I just wasn't ready to receive it." The workshops became a bridge between my online community and my local community, proving that the principles of authentic connection and mutual support could work just as effectively in person as they did through screens and comment sections. As my channel approached 600,000 subscribers in early spring, I received a message that brought everything full circle in the most unexpected way. It came from Tyler Martinez, the son of Linda Martinez, the Phoenix woman who had been one of my earliest supporters. "Mrs. Thornfield," he wrote, "my mother passed away last month after a battle with cancer. She spent her final weeks watching your videos and participating in the Rebuild community forums. She said your channel helped her feel less alone during the hardest period of her life, and that the community you built gave her purpose and connection when she needed it most." Tyler went on to explain that his mother had left instructions for him to continue her monthly donations to the Rebuild Community Scholarship Fund and to share her story as an example of how online connections could provide real-world support and meaning. Linda's death devastated me in ways I hadn't expected. I had never met her in person, but she had been one of the foundational members of our community, someone whose wisdom and encouragement had shaped countless conversations and supported dozens of women through their own transitions. At the same time, her son's message reminded me that the impact of what we had built extended beyond business metrics or policy achievements. We had created a space where people could find genuine connection, practical support, and the courage to keep going during their most difficult moments. That was worth more than any subscriber milestone or revenue target. Linda's memorial video, which I created with contributions from community members who had been touched by her presence in our forums, became a testament to the real relationships that had formed through digital platforms. Women from across the country shared stories of how Linda had supported them, encouraged them, and celebrated their successes as if they were family members.
The video also sparked a new initiative within the Rebuild community, the Linda Martinez Memorial Mentorship Program, which paired women who were just beginning their rebuilding journeys with others who had successfully navigated similar transitions. The program launched with over 500 mentor-mentee matches and a waiting list of women eager to participate on both sides of the relationship. As summer arrived and my channel surpassed 650,000 subscribers, I realized that the journey from out of touch to this level of impact had taught me something profound about the nature of criticism and community. The people who had initially dismissed me hadn't been entirely wrong. I had been isolated in some ways, limited in my perspective, and perhaps too comfortable in my assumptions about how the world worked. But instead of becoming defensive about their criticism, I had used it as motivation to expand my understanding, connect more authentically with people whose experiences differed from mine, and ultimately build something that served a much broader community than I could have reached from my original position. The channel had become more than content creation or even community building. It has become a catalyst for cultural change around how we discuss success, struggle, and the obligations we have to support each other through life's inevitable transitions. On a quiet Sunday evening in July, exactly 3 years and 10 months after recording my first video, I sat in my kitchen reviewing analytics that showed our community had now reached people in over 40 countries. The numbers were impressive, but what struck me more was the diversity of languages appearing in the comment sections, the variety of cultural contexts in which women were applying principles we had developed, and the universal nature of the challenges and aspirations being shared. Emma called that evening from her summer internship in Chicago, where she was working for a nonprofit focused on women's economic development. "Mom," she said, "my supervisor mentioned your congressional testimony in our staff meeting today. She said it was one of the most effective pieces of advocacy she'd seen because it combined personal narrative with systemic analysis. She didn't know I was your daughter until I told her afterward." The pride in Emma's voice was different from the typical parent-child dynamic. She wasn't just proud of my accomplishments, she was proud of the way I had used my platform to help others and create positive change. More importantly, she was applying lessons from my journey to her own career choices and community involvement. "You showed me that the most powerful response to criticism isn't arguing or defending yourself," Emma continued. "It's proving people wrong by becoming better and helping others become better too. That's what I want to do with my career, turn my own difficult experiences into resources for helping other people." As I ended that conversation with Emma, I realized that perhaps the most important legacy of the entire journey wasn't the subscriber count, the policy changes, or even the community we had built. It was the example I had set for my children about resilience, authenticity, and service to others. They had learned that setbacks could become comebacks, that criticism could become motivation, and that personal struggles could be transformed into community resources. They had seen that success wasn't something to apologize for, but something to use responsibly for the benefit of others. The notification sound chimed on my phone one more time that evening. Another comment, another story, another person finding their way to our corner of the internet where being successful after struggle wasn't something to hide, but something to celebrate and share. I opened my laptop, ready to respond to messages and engage with the community that had transformed my life as much as I had apparently transformed theirs. The journey from out of touch to 650,000 subscribers and congressional testimony and international recognition had been extraordinary, but it was just the beginning of what we could accomplish together. They had called me out of touch, and in responding to that criticism, I had discovered exactly what it meant to be truly, authentically, powerfully in touch with the experiences that matter most: loss and recovery, struggle and success, individual resilience, and collective support. The woman who had once stayed silent to avoid making waves had found her voice and used it to create ripples of positive change that would continue long after the camera stopped recording and the comment sections moved on to new conversations. I smiled, opened the first message, and continued the work of turning personal truth into community transformation, one conversation at a time. The autumn of my 4th year brought an unexpected challenge that would test everything I had learned about authenticity, community, and responsibility. An investigative journalist named Marcus Rodriguez from the Washington Post had spent 3 months researching what he called the dark side of the inspiration economy, focusing specifically on content creators who had built platforms around personal trauma and struggle. His article, published on a Tuesday morning in October, was titled "The Monetization of Misery: How YouTube Stars Turn Tragedy into Profit." My channel featured prominently in the piece, along with several other creators who had built audiences by sharing difficult personal experiences.
Rodriguez's central argument was that creators like me were exploiting our own trauma and the vulnerabilities of our audiences for financial gain. He questioned the ethics of building businesses around personal loss, suggested that we were creating unhealthy parasocial relationships with viewers who saw us as friends rather than content creators, and argued that our success stories might be giving false hope to people facing circumstances that couldn't be overcome through individual effort alone. The article was thoroughly researched and raised legitimate questions that I had grappled with privately since the early days of my channel. Was I exploiting David's death for content? Was I giving my audience unrealistic expectations about what was possible after major setbacks? Was the business I had built around my personal story ethical and sustainable? But Rodriguez had also mischaracterized crucial aspects of my work and the community we had built. He had interviewed several of my viewers, but had focused primarily on those who admitted to feeling dependent on my content for emotional support, while ignoring the thousands who had used the community as a launching pad for their own success and then moved on to independent achievement. More problematically, he had dismissed the policy advocacy work and the systemic changes we had helped create, framing them as publicity stunts rather than genuine efforts to address structural barriers facing women in transition. The article went viral within hours of publication, sparking intense debate about the ethics of personal storytelling in the digital age. Some readers defended content creators' right to share their experiences and monetize their platforms. Others argued that we had a responsibility to be more transparent about the potential limitations of our advice and the financial incentives behind our content. The response from my community was swift and passionate. Within 24 hours, over 500 viewers had posted detailed responses on various platforms, sharing specific examples of how my content and the rebuilt community had helped them create tangible improvements in their lives. They posted screenshots of business revenues, photos of new homes they had purchased, acceptance letters to graduate programs they had applied to after watching my videos about education after loss. But what struck me most was how many of them focused not on defending me personally, but on defending the community we had built together. They wrote about friendships formed through the platform, business partnerships that had emerged from forum discussions, and support networks that had sustained them through difficult periods that had nothing to do with my original content. Sarah Mitchell from Denver wrote a particularly powerful response. Marcus Rodriguez completely missed the point of Margaret's channel. Yes, she makes money from her content. She's transparent about that and deserves to be compensated for the value she provides. But the real magic isn't in her individual story. It's in the community she created, where thousands of women support each other through major life transitions. That community exists independently of Margaret now. She gave us a starting point, but we built something together that's much bigger than any one person's platform.
Reading responses like Sarah's helped me understand how to respond to the criticism in a way that was honest about the article's valid points, while also clarifying what our community actually represented. I decided to address the controversy directly in a video titled "The Ethics of Sharing Your Story: A Response to Fair Criticism." Instead of becoming defensive or dismissive, I acknowledged the legitimate concerns Rodriguez had raised while providing context he had missed. "He's right that I make money from sharing my story," I said to the camera, "and he's right that this raises ethical questions that every content creator should grapple with seriously. The question isn't whether it's appropriate to monetize personal experiences. The question is whether you're doing it in ways that serve your audience's best interests or just your own." I went on to explain the safeguards I had put in place, the advisory board of mental health professionals who reviewed my content for potentially harmful messaging, the clear disclaimers about the limitations of my experience, the scholarship programs that ensured access for women who couldn't afford community membership, and the emphasis on peer support rather than dependence on my individual guidance. Most importantly, I addressed the concern about false hope by discussing the concept of survivorship bias, the tendency for successful outcomes to be more visible than unsuccessful ones, creating skewed perceptions about what was typically possible. "I don't represent what every widow will experience," I explained. "I represent what some widows might experience under certain circumstances, with specific advantages, significant effort, and yes, some degree of luck. My story isn't a guarantee or a prescription. It's one example of what's possible, shared in the hope that it might provide useful insights for people facing similar challenges." The response video became one of my most watched pieces of content, attracting viewers who had never seen my channel before, but were interested in the broader questions about ethics and authenticity in digital media. The comment section became a thoughtful forum for discussing the responsibilities of content creators, the nature of parasocial relationships, and the difference between inspiration and exploitation. More significantly, the controversy led to conversations within my community about sustainability and independence. Many longtime members started their own channels, blogs, and support groups, creating a network of interconnected but autonomous platforms that could survive and thrive regardless of what happened to my individual content creation. Dr. Maria Santos, who had become a close collaborator and friend, suggested that this evolution was exactly what healthy community building should look like. The goal was never to create permanent dependence on your platform, she observed. The goal was to give people tools and connections they could use to build their own sustainable support systems. The controversy also prompted me to make changes in how I structured my business and content. I established a formal ethics board that included mental health professionals, financial advisors, and community members who could provide ongoing guidance about responsible content creation. I implemented more rigorous disclosure policies and created clearer boundaries between my role as content creator and my role as community facilitator. Most importantly, I began planning for my own succession within the community I had created. At 55, I was still energetic and passionate about the work, but I recognized that sustainable community building required leadership development and knowledge transfer that didn't depend on any single individual. The succession planning process revealed just how much the community had grown beyond my initial vision. The Rebuild community now included over 75,000 members across 6 countries. Local chapters were hosting monthly events in 37 cities. The mentorship program had facilitated over 2,000 successful matches. Members had collectively started over 1,500 businesses, with a combined annual revenue exceeding $50 million. But perhaps most remarkably, many of the women who had joined as members seeking support had evolved into leaders providing guidance to newer participants. Catherine Williams, the Baltimore woman who had started her property management business after watching my early videos, was now running business development workshops for women over 50. Teresa Johnson from Detroit had expanded her catering business into a culinary school that specifically recruited women transitioning after major life changes. These success stories weren't dependent on my continued content creation or community involvement. They represented sustainable, scalable impact that would continue regardless of what happened to my individual platform. The winter of my 4th year brought another unexpected development that highlighted how far the movement had evolved beyond my personal story. Harvard Business School invited me to participate in a case study about community-driven economic development, focusing specifically on how digital platforms could facilitate real-world economic activity among underserved populations. The research team, led by Dr. Jennifer Park, had been studying the Rebuild community for 18 months, tracking member outcomes and analyzing the factors that contributed to successful transitions. Their preliminary findings suggested that peer-to-peer support networks were significantly more effective than traditional social services in helping women over 45 achieve economic stability after major life disruptions. What you've accidentally created, Dr. Park explained during our initial interview, is a scalable model for addressing a massive social and economic challenge. There are millions of women in this demographic who face similar transitions, but existing support systems weren't designed for their specific needs or circumstances. The Harvard case study process required me to examine my own journey with unprecedented analytical rigor. Dr. Park's team wanted to understand not just what had happened, but why it had worked, which elements were replicable, and how similar communities could be developed to serve other populations facing different types of transitions. The analysis revealed patterns I hadn't recognized during the experience itself. My success as a community builder hadn't come from my individual charisma or storytelling ability. It had come from my willingness to be genuinely vulnerable while maintaining clear boundaries, to share decision-making power with community members, and to prioritize collective success over individual recognition.
More importantly, the research showed that the community's effectiveness came from what Dr. Park termed matched vulnerability, the connection between people who had faced similar challenges at different points in their recovery. Members weren't just consuming inspirational content, they were engaged in reciprocal relationships where they provided support to others while receiving it themselves. Traditional support groups focus on shared struggle, Dr. Park observed. Your community focuses on shared resilience. That's a fundamentally different model, and it produces fundamentally different outcomes. The Harvard research attracted attention from policymakers, nonprofit organizations, and technology companies interested in scaling similar communities for other populations. I received inquiries about developing platforms for veterans transitioning to civilian life, for people recovering from addiction, for individuals navigating career changes in their 50s and 60s. Each opportunity represented a choice about how to use the platform and expertise I had developed. Some offered significant financial rewards, but would have required me to expand beyond my areas of genuine knowledge and experience. Others aligned with my values, but would have stretched my time and energy beyond sustainable limits. The decision-making framework I developed during this period became one of my most valuable contributions to the community. Instead of making choices based on growth potential or revenue opportunities, I focused on 3 criteria: authentic alignment with my experience and expertise, genuine benefit to underserved populations, and sustainable impact that could continue without my direct involvement. This framework led me to decline several lucrative opportunities while accepting others that aligned with the community's core mission. Most significantly, I agreed to partner with the Department of Labor on a pilot program that would adapt the Rebuild community model for women receiving unemployment benefits after corporate layoffs or plant closures. The pilot program launched in 5 cities during the spring of my 5th year, serving over 1,000 women who had lost jobs due to economic restructuring. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Participants found new employment 40% faster than the control group, started businesses at 3 times the national rate for their demographic, and reported significantly higher levels of confidence and life satisfaction 6 months after program completion. The success of the pilot program led to federal funding for nationwide expansion, creating a sustainable revenue stream that allowed me to reduce my dependence on individual content creation while still maintaining the community and expanding its impact.
As my channel approached 700,000 subscribers in early summer, I realized that the numbers had become almost irrelevant to the actual work we were doing. The subscriber count was a vanity metric. The real metrics were business starts, job placements, educational achievements, and most importantly, the development of sustainable support networks that continued functioning regardless of my individual involvement. The 5th anniversary of my first video arrived on a warm evening in July. Instead of creating a retrospective about my personal journey, I decided to feature 5 women whose stories represented the evolution of our community from individual inspiration to collective empowerment. The anniversary special became a celebration of what was possible when people used digital platforms not just to consume content, but to build lasting relationships and create real-world change. The women featured had all started as viewers or community members and had evolved into leaders, mentors, and successful entrepreneurs in their own right. Most importantly, their stories demonstrated that the principles we had developed, authentic vulnerability, strategic thinking under pressure, community support without dependence, were applicable across a wide range of circumstances and could produce sustainable positive outcomes for people facing very different types of challenges. As I recorded the closing segment of that anniversary special, sitting in the same kitchen where I had first responded to Facebook criticism 5 years earlier, I reflected on how completely my understanding of success and impact had evolved. The woman who had started this journey was focused on defending herself against unfair accusations and proving that critics were wrong about her character and circumstances. The woman I had become was focused on creating systems and communities that could help thousands of people navigate major life transitions more successfully. The transformation hadn't been linear or predictable, and it certainly hadn't been comfortable, but it had been profoundly meaningful in ways that individual achievement could never match. The journey from out of touch to 700,000 subscribers and federal policy partnerships and Harvard case studies had taught me that the most powerful response to criticism isn't argument or defense. It's transformation that serves others as much as yourself.
I had been called out of touch, and in learning to be genuinely in touch with the experiences that mattered most, I had accidentally discovered what it meant to create lasting positive change in the world. The notification arrived on a Wednesday morning, exactly 2 years and 3 months after I had published my first video. My channel has reached 500,000 subscribers. 500,000 people had chosen to follow my journey from defensive widow to accidentally influential voice in conversations about success, authenticity, and community responsibility. The number felt simultaneously massive and meaningless. Massive because I could never have imagined that a response to Facebook criticism would reach so many people. Meaningless because the real impact wasn't in the subscriber count, it was in the individual transformations happening in comment sections, private messages, and real-world meetups across the country. That same morning, I received an email that brought the journey full circle in the most unexpected way. "Dear Mrs. Thornfield," it began, "my name is Jessica Morrison, and I believe we know each other from our children's school. I owe you an apology that's about 2 years overdue." I stared at the screen, remembering Jessica as the parent who had criticized me at Sophie's parent-teacher conference, the one who had accused me of having disposable income when I offered to donate books to the school library. The woman whose dismissive comments had been part of the pattern that eventually drove me to create the channel in the first place. "I've been watching your YouTube channel for the past 6 months," her email continued. "I had no idea who you were when I first came across your videos. I found them through a financial planning group I joined on Facebook. It wasn't until I saw you mention Riverside Heights Elementary that I realized you were the same Margaret Thornfield I had been so judgmental toward." She went on to explain that she had been struggling with her own feelings of inadequacy and financial insecurity when she had lashed out at me. Her husband had been unemployed for 8 months, and she had been working double shifts as a nurse while trying to maintain the appearance that everything was fine. Seeing me make suggestions that seemed to come from a place of financial comfort had triggered her own shame and frustration. "Watching your videos helped me understand that you weren't trying to show off or make anyone feel bad," she wrote. "You were just sharing ideas from your own experience. More importantly, your content helped me realize that I was making myself miserable by pretending our situation wasn't as difficult as it actually was. I've started being more honest about our struggles, and it's amazing how much support we've received once people knew we needed help." Jessica's apology was gracious and thoughtful, but what struck me most was how she had transformed her own relationship with struggle and success. She had started a small business providing home healthcare services, was building financial stability for her family, and was no longer apologizing for either her previous difficulties or her current improvements. "I want to thank you for showing me that there's a difference between being tone-deaf and being hopeful," she concluded. "Your suggestions weren't insensitive. They were based on the belief that difficult situations could be improved. I needed to hear that, even if I wasn't ready to hear it at the time." I replied to Jessica's email, and we arranged to meet for coffee the following weekend. The conversation was surreal, sitting across from someone who had unknowingly played such a pivotal role in my journey, discussing how we had both been changed by experiences neither of us could have predicted. "I feel like I should apologize for accidentally inspiring your YouTube career," Jessica said, laughing. "Don't apologize," I replied. "You gave me exactly what I needed, even though neither of us knew it at the time." Our conversation led to Jessica becoming a guest on my channel, sharing her own story of transformation from defensive criticism to entrepreneurial action. The video, titled "When the Person Who Called You Out of Touch Becomes Your Biggest Fan," became one of my most popular, demonstrating the possibility for growth and understanding, even in relationships that begin with conflict and misunderstanding. But Jessica's transformation was just one example of how the channel had created ripple effects I never could have anticipated. Over the past 2 years, I had received thousands of messages from viewers who had made major life changes after engaging with my content. Women who had started businesses, ended toxic relationships, pursued delayed education, relocated for better opportunities, and most importantly, stopped hiding their successes to make others comfortable. The most profound example came from a viewer named Catherine Williams in Baltimore, who had been following my channel since my third video. Catherine was 57, had been widowed for 4 years, and had spent those years convinced that she was too old to rebuild her life in any meaningful way. "I was existing, not living," she wrote in a message that accompanied a video she had created for my monthly viewer spotlight series. I had convinced myself that at my age, after losing my husband, the best I could hope for was to maintain what I had and not be a burden to my adult children. Catherine's video documented her transformation over 18 months of watching my channel. She had started by implementing small financial strategies I had shared, then progressed to taking a real estate course, and eventually launched a successful property management business that now employs 3 other women over 50. Margaret's channel didn't just give me practical advice, Catherine explained in her video. It gave me permission to want more from my life. It showed me that rebuilding after loss wasn't selfish or unrealistic. It was possible and necessary. Catherine's business had generated enough income to allow her daughter to buy her first home and to establish a scholarship fund for widowed women pursuing business education. Her success had created opportunities for others in ways that multiplied the positive impact far beyond her individual achievement. Stories like Catherine's helped me understand that the channel had evolved into something much larger than personal storytelling or even community building. It had become a catalyst for economic and social change, particularly among women who had been marginalized or underestimated because of their age, their personal circumstances, or their refusal to perform struggle in ways that made others comfortable. The milestone of reaching 500,000 subscribers coincided with an opportunity that would test everything I had learned about maintaining authenticity while expanding impact. Netflix approached me about creating a documentary series based on my book, following women who had rebuilt their lives after major setbacks.
The project was both thrilling and terrifying. Netflix had the resources to reach millions of people, but they also had their own agenda and creative vision that might not align with the values that had made my channel successful. I spent weeks in meetings with producers, trying to understand whether they wanted to tell authentic stories about resilience and transformation, or whether they wanted to create entertainment that simplified complex experiences for mass consumption. The turning point came when I insisted that any women featured in the series would have creative control over how their stories were told. I had learned from my YouTube community that authenticity couldn't be manufactured or directed. It could only emerge when people felt safe to tell the truth about their experiences. Real Stories, Women Who Rebuild premiered 8 months later to critical acclaim and massive viewership. But more importantly, it introduced the themes and conversations from my channel to audiences who might never have found my content otherwise. The series sparked national discussions about widowhood, financial recovery, entrepreneurship after 50, and the ways society underestimates women's capacity for reinvention. The documentary also revealed how my personal journey had intersected with broader social and economic trends. The producers had done research showing that women over 40 were starting businesses at higher rates than any other demographic, despite facing significant obstacles in accessing capital, mentorship, and market recognition. My story wasn't unique. It was part of a massive wave of women who were refusing to accept limited expectations about what their lives could become after major transitions. The success of the Netflix series brought my subscriber count to over 750,000, but it also brought opportunities and responsibilities that forced me to make decisions about the future of my platform. Publishing houses wanted me to write more books, speaking agencies wanted to book me for corporate events, investment firms wanted me to launch financial products for my audience. Each opportunity represented a choice between growth and integrity, between reach and authenticity, between influence and exploitation. I had seen too many content creators lose their way when they prioritized scale over substance, and I was determined not to repeat their mistakes. The solution came from revisiting the original purpose of the channel, creating space for honest conversations about experiences that people usually handled in isolation. Instead of expanding into areas where I lacked expertise or passion, I decided to deepen my focus on the intersection of personal transformation and community building. I launched the Rebuild Community, a membership platform that connected women going through major life transitions with mentors, resources, and each other. Rather than trying to scale my individual reach, I created infrastructure for peer-to-peer support and learning. The community included business incubators for women over 40, financial literacy programs designed specifically for people rebuilding after loss, and local chapters that organized in-person support and networking.
The rebuild community grew to over 50,000 members in its first year, generating enough revenue to support a small staff and provide scholarships for women who couldn't afford membership fees. More importantly, it created sustainable support systems that didn't depend on my individual content creation or charismatic leadership. On the third anniversary of my first video, I published a reflection piece titled "What I've Learned About Being in Touch with Reality." Instead of celebrating subscriber milestones or business achievements, I focused on the personal transformations that had made everything else possible. 3 years ago, I said to the camera, sitting in the same kitchen where I had written my first angry response to Facebook critics, now I understand it was an invitation to examine my assumptions, connect with people who shared my experiences, and ultimately build something that helps others navigate similar challenges. I talked about how the process of creating content forced me to articulate ideas I had never fully formed, to examine my own privilege and limitations, and to learn from people whose experiences differed significantly from mine. I discussed how building a community had taught me the difference between influence and impact, between being heard and being helpful. Most importantly, I addressed the question that people asked me most frequently: whether I regretted the loss and hardship that had led to the channel's creation. I wouldn't choose to lose David again, I said. I wouldn't choose to go through financial devastation or social judgment or any of the difficult experiences that brought me to this point. But I also can't regret the person those experiences helped me become, or the community they helped me build, or the conversations they enabled me to have. As I finished recording that anniversary video, I realized that the journey from out of touch to 500,000 subscribers was less about vindication and more about transformation. The people who had initially criticized me hadn't been entirely wrong. I had been somewhat isolated from certain realities and perspectives. But instead of becoming defensive about their criticism, I had used it as motivation to expand my understanding and connect more authentically with a broader community. The channel had grown from a response to local Facebook drama into a platform that reached people across the globe who were navigating loss, rebuilding after setbacks, and refusing to apologize for their resilience. The subscriber count was just a number, but the conversations happening in comment sections, the businesses being started by viewers, the relationships being formed through community meetups, and the cultural shifts happening around how we discuss success and struggle, those were the real measures of impact. That evening, after publishing the anniversary video, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and opened my laptop to respond to comments and messages. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma, now a college freshman studying business and communications. "Just watched your anniversary video, Mom," she wrote. "I'm proud of how you turned something that hurt you into something that helps other people. You taught me that the best response to criticism is to prove people wrong by becoming better, not by arguing with them." As I read Emma's message, I realized that the most important legacy of Gachievel wasn't the subscriber count or the business success, or even the community we had built. It was the example I had set for my children about how to respond to setbacks, criticism, and unexpected challenges with resilience, authenticity, and determination to help others. The journey from being called out of touch to reaching 500,000 subscribers took 3 years, countless hours of work, and more vulnerability than I had ever thought possible. But it had also created something unprecedented, a platform where women could tell the truth about their experiences without apology, where success was celebrated rather than resented, and where the messiness of real life was acknowledged and supported rather than hidden and judged. I was no longer the woman who stayed silent to avoid conflict, or the woman who apologized for surviving well. I was the woman who had found her voice, used it to help others find theirs, and built a community that would continue growing and evolving long after I stopped making videos. They had called me out of touch, and they had been right in ways they never intended. I had been out of touch with my own power, with my community of peers, and with the possibility that my worst experiences could become resources for helping others navigate similar challenges. Now I was very much in touch, with 500,000 people who trusted me with their stories, with a community that supported each other through transitions and transformations, and with the knowledge that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is having someone challenge your assumptions about who you are and what you're capable of becoming. The notification sound chimed on my phone. Another comment, another message, another person finding their way to our corner of the internet where being successful after struggle wasn't something to apologize for, but something to celebrate and share. I smiled and kept typing. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.